And we'll start with Darren Wilkinson that will talk us about coastal and at sea population of European storm-petrels.
Hi, my name is Darren Wilkinson and I'm a PhD student at University College Cork in Ireland. And today I'm going to be presenting our findings on the distribution and at-sea population size of the European storm-petrel over an area of about 450,000 kilometres squared in the Northeast Atlantic using aerial surveys. As we all are aware, determining the distribution and population size of marine species is vitally important for conservation. However, for many small, cryptic, pelagic species, it's like we don't really know much about it due to their wide ranges, high mobility, and cryptic breeding habits. And this is the case for the European storm-petrel, which is the smallest breeding seabird in the North Atlantic, weighing only about 25 grams. Despite its small size, it thrives in the open ocean, spending most of its life far from land other than for breeding. In the Atlantic, there are large breeding populations around the coast of Ireland, the United Kingdom, the Faroe Islands, Iceland and Norway, with smaller populations of France, Spain and the Canary Islands. And also the Mediterranean subspecies is found, as the name suggests, in the Mediterranean Sea. And the small size of the storm-petrel makes this an extraordinary but extremely challenging species to study. Until relatively recently, most of what we knew about the at-sea distribution of the species was based on ship surveys, but now the miniaturization of GPS devices has enabled researchers to deploy tags that weigh less than 1 gram on breeding storm-petrels, and this has greatly improved our knowledge of the foraging trips that they take during the breeding season. However, like all tracking studies, there are several limitations. For example, a substantial portion of the population, such as non-breeders and those that breed in inaccessible locations, are not represented in the data, and collecting data from a representative sample of colonies across the species' entire breeding range has considerable logistical and financial constraints. And this is really relevant for the storm-petrel due to their preference of nesting on remote islands that can often be near impossible to access. They nest out of sight in rocky crevices, stone walls, and in burrows, and they only move to and from the colony at night to avoid detection from predators. Not only does this make deploying and recovering GPS tags a challenge, also censusing breeding colonies to determine a population estimate and monitor trends is extremely difficult. And so, instead of relying on GPS tags and colony censuses, we wanted to see if we could use aerial survey data to firstly produce a species distribution model to see where in Irish waters storm-petrels are found during the breeding season, and then see if we could use this model to create an informative population estimate to see if aerial surveys could be an alternative or complementary monitoring method compared to the kind of traditional labor-intensive colony-based censuses. The study area for this was the Irish EEZ, which covers an area of about 450,000 kilometres squared, and Ireland is a really important breeding location for the European storm-petrel, holding an estimated 20 to 23% of the global breeding population, and there's colonies all along the west coast of the country, with several large colonies containing thousands and thousands of breeding pairs, all found in the southwest. And so the Observe Aerial Survey Programme was an Irish government-funded project that ran over 4 years with the aims of investigating the occurrence, distribution and abundance of seabirds, cetaceans and other marine megafauna species in Irish waters. A combination of offshore broad-scale surveys, as shown on the left, and inshore fine-scale surveys, as shown on the right, were conducted following a standard strip transect methodology by a team of trained observers. All survey flights were conducted at speeds between 90 and 100 knots, and at an altitude of 183 meters or 600 feet for the broad-scale surveys, and 76 meters or 250 feet for the fine-scale surveys. And over the course of all the aerial surveys, there were 2,742 sightings of storm-petrel species, and this came to almost 4,500 individuals. Due to similar appearance of storm-petrel species, it was not possible to identify them to the species level from the aircraft. However, in Ireland, there's only a very small breeding population of Leach's storm-petrels, and Wilson's storm-petrels are only very occasionally seen in Irish waters. And so these species were expected to only account for a very, very small minority of the at-sea observations of storm-petrels during the project. And just to address a question that I'm sure a lot of you are probably thinking is, how can you possibly see these tiny seabirds from an airplane? And fortunately, European storm-petrels have this band of white plumage on their rump, and it's this small flash of white moving across the water that allows the observers to catch a glimpse of them. So the study area was divided into a 4x4 kilometer grid, and I calculated how many storm-petrels were observed in each grid cell over the course of the aerial surveys. I also sourced a range of predictive variables and appended these to the center point of each grid cell, and these included things like chlorophyll A concentration, sea surface temperature, distance to the coast, and so on. First, because 2 different survey altitudes were used, 183 meters for the broad-scale surveys and 76 meters for the fine-scale surveys, I wanted to test if the survey altitude had an impact on the number of storm-petrels that were observed per grid cell during the surveys. And I won't go into too much detail on this model, but simply I made the generalized additive model. The number of storm-petrels observed per grid cell was the response variable, and I included the following predictive variables. And I only retained the grid cells that were surveyed by both broad and fine-scale surveys for this analysis. And the highlight of the results, there was no difference in the number of storm-petrels observed per grid cell between the 2 survey altitudes. So then I wanted to create a species distribution model using the data set of all the surveyed grid cells to produce a species distribution model to predict the distribution and produce a population estimate. And once again, I used a generalized additive model with a negative binomial distribution and a log-link function. Once again, the number of storm-petrels observed per grid cell was the response variable, and the final model included these predictive variables. But one thing to note is that a separate bidimensional spline for longitude and latitude was created for each of the breeding stages by creating a factor smooth interaction. And the 2 breeding stages were pre-laying, or the time before the egg is laid, and post-laying, which combined both the incubation and chick rearing phases. And this was done because during the pre-laying stage, both members of a breeding pair tend to spend the day at sea, and so would be available to be detected by the aerial surveys. But incubating birds and those brooding the chick are confined to the nest during the day, therefore reducing the number of breeding birds at sea. And after validating this model, I use it to predict the distribution and abundance across the entire study area. And the result of that are these 2 maps, which shows areas of high predicted abundance off the south, southwest, and west of the country. And I'll just really quickly highlight a few of the key results rather than go into everything. Storm-petrel abundance showed an interesting curvilinear relationship with distance to the coast, and showed a displaced coastal distribution where there was low abundance at the coast, likely due to the avoidance of avian predators, which then increased with distance, peaking at about 30 to 50 kilometers from the coast, with further peaks at about 120 kilometers and 220 kilometers. And this band of high predicted abundance, about 30 to 50 kilometers, corresponded with high offshore chlorophyll A concentration, and also almost perfectly aligned with a front going past the southwest coast of the country, which divides the offshore and coastal waters and strongly influences the spatial and temporal distribution of plankton in the area, potentially resulting in abundant and reliably available food for the storm-petrels. And then summing up all the predicted number of storm-petrels in each grid cell, I could make a population estimate for both stages. The pre-laying estimate came to 151,625, and the post-laying was just over 104,000. The post-laying stage estimate is a bit challenging to interpret because during this time there will be both breeders and a large number of non-breeding immatures in the study area, and our estimate of 104,000 would be a major underestimate of the total population of breeders and non-breeders, because all the birds breeding and incubating and brooding their chick will not be represented in the data. But we will look at the pre-laying stage estimates in more detail, because these surveys were done in May and June when only the breeders would be present in the North Atlantic. So taking this estimate of 152,000 breeding storm-petrels, I compared it to the most recent colony count, which was 216,846. And to be honest, I wasn't expecting our modeled prediction to be anywhere near the colony censuses, but actually it's not that far away, particularly to their lower confidence interval, and when you take into account that we actually don't really know how reliable and how accurate our colony counts are. And the aerial surveys are definitely missing some of the sightings of storm-petrels, particularly those that are sitting in the water, but the models can be used to produce a minimum estimate of the population, and this is what we can monitor over time to check for trends. Colony censuses, although extremely labour intensive and logistically challenging, are vitally important for individual breeding site management and conservation. But the aerial surveys conducted during the pre-laying stage may be a complementary monitoring method that is worth investing in to monitor the trends in abundance, particularly in the years between the national colony censuses, which in Ireland and Britain only take place about once every 10 years. And so, to conclude, the European storm-petrels in Irish waters have a displaced coastal distribution, avoiding coastal areas during the day, likely to avoid predators. Also, in the study area, there was the hotspot of abundance was located 30 to 50 kilometers from the coast, with the storm-petrels likely benefiting from frontal activity in the region. And lastly, our results suggest that aerial surveys do have the potential to be used as a monitoring method and will help us better understand the trends in the European storm-petrel population within our study area, complementing the traditional censuses and with the added benefit of also simultaneously collecting a huge amount of data on other seabirds and marine megafauna species. So just would like to thank you for listening, and I'd also like to thank all the pilots, observers, data loggers, and everyone else who's involved in the project. So, thank you.
Is there any question to Darren? Jose? Yeah.
It's a very nice talk, and I appreciate how much work's probably gone into that. So, was there? You said it was a strict transect survey. Was there no distance data collected?
Distance sampling was done for sightings of cetaceans and sharks and stuff like that, but for the seabirds, it was just using the assumption that they were seeing everything within a kind of 200-meter transect on each side of the plane, but the distance sampling was for cetaceans only.
So I wonder if a good follow-up would be to do try and work out what proportion were being missed by doing some distance sampling.
Yeah, that's something that does need to be taken into account. Like, this project was kind of designed to try and kind of see everything, and wasn't really particularly targeted for seabirds, let alone small storm-petrels. And it was kind of more of an opportunistic study to see if there was actually potential with the aerial surveys. And certainly it looks like with the observer ones, where the people are actually seen, like making the records, that they do seem to do a good enough job at spotting the storm-petrels.
Well, over there, on the top, right side. Thank you, Jose.
Sorry, maybe I missed this, but it's a technical question. How did you deal with the detection probabilities varying between these high and low survey heights when you don't have the same spatial range of coverage, in particular when you want to end up with a spatially explicit distribution model?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't catch that question.
As a more technical side of how you dealt with the different detection probabilities from different flight altitudes, because the coverage wasn't the same throughout the whole area that you're investigating.
Yeah, like survey effort, which was the area that was surveyed in each grid cell, was included in the models as an offset term, so that took into account the variance in kind of survey effort across the area. And then I just used survey altitude as a kind of binomial variable in the model, and was included in the generalized additive models. Does that answer it?
Cool, thank you. Any more questions to Darren? No?
Yeah, sorry. The question of Huon was very difficult to hear in the back, so I might ask something difficult. But did you tell that you didn't use distance sampling for your analysis?
Not for the seabirds. It was done with the cetacean and shark observations, but not seabirds.
Yeah, and how did you account for, and did you notice any any kind of responses of the storm-petrels to the airplane?
That wasn't something that was taken into account in our models. I don't think that information was recorded by the data loggers when they were recording it. If they did notice any disturbance, so unfortunately that's not something that I could factor into my analysis.
Okay.
Well, thank you. One last question. Over there, please.
It's kind of an aside, but I mean, amazing data set. I really like that. Do you know if the observers made a note of whether the birds are on the surface or on the wing when they're recorded? And then did you think about that in your spatial distribution?
Yeah, the majority of the observations, if not all of them, were flying storm-petrels, so they were definitely missing ones that could have been sitting on the water. So like, my population estimates are a minimum estimate, and also I couldn't do anything about are they flying in certain areas, sitting in others. That just data was missed.
So just to clarify, you think the ones on the water were not counted, or were they seen and not counted, or were they not detected?
I don't think they were detected. I think the white patch is the kind of the key thing to seeing them, and when they're sitting on the water, that kind of gets blocked by their wings. So the chance of seeing them really dramatically decreases.
You might think about whether you can use the GPS data on behavior, time spent in different behavioral states to calibrate. It's a kind of availability bias, which would normally apply to diving birds, but could apply to flighted birds, and that'll bring your estimate up closer to the count.
And I have been collecting GPS data from iris colonies, which I haven't got around to kind of comparing with my model here, but that's something I'm looking to do down the line.
Sounds cool.
Thank you very much, Darren. So the next talk is April Hedd from Canada, and she will tell us how can we improve the conservation of Leach storm-petrels in the North Atlantic.
I will try. So this is on. Can you hear me okay? Yes? So my name's April, and you can see from the extensive list of co-authors here, I'm presenting this work on Leach's storm-petrel monitoring, tracking, and modeling on behalf of a large group of collaborators, many of whom have been working on this species for several decades. So Leach's storm-petrel is a small nocturnal and highly pelagic species that breeds both in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. The green areas on the map here show the winter distribution, migration and wintering areas, and you can see that in the Atlantic this species is found as far south as South Africa. About 40% of the global population of Leach's storm-petrel nests in the Atlantic, and if we zoom in further, more than 90% of the Atlantic basin population breeds off the east coast of Canada, including the world's largest colony, which is one of my study colonies at Baccalieu Island, Newfoundland, where there's about 2 million breeding pairs. Eastern Canada, therefore, has a very high stewardship responsibility for this species, both at the local scale and at the global scale. Within our region, Leach's is doing quite poorly. So information from these 8 major colonies within Eastern Canada show pretty sharp declines. Modeling estimates that we've lost about half of the breeding population over the last 3 generations. And there's similar declines observed over the same time period in Iceland, and sharper declines in the UK, which indicates that the species is declining across the Atlantic basin, which may suggest that some of the drivers of population decline are occurring outside the breeding period, so maybe on the wintering grounds. IUCN uplisted this species to globally vulnerable in 2016. In Canada, COSEWIC assessed the species as threatened back in 2020, and it's nationally red listed in both Iceland and in the UK. So why are storm-petrels declining? The short answer is we don't know. A threat assessment was done as part of our COSEWIC process, and it identified these 4 categories, but none of them came out as high when we considered potential impact on population trend. So there's no one smoking gun for driving the declines as far as we know. And much of what we know comes from expert opinion. So Ingrid Paulet, who we heard from earlier this morning, led a study last year that summarized threats at the global scale, both on land and at sea, and there were quite a diversity. A few factors, though, came out as important in both of the threats assessments. Perhaps not surprisingly, predation for this species, both by avian predators and mammals at colonies. Light attraction in the offshore, both attraction to vessels and also offshore oil and gas platforms, and also onshore light attraction, which is, light attraction in the offshore has been noted for a very long time, but onshore light attraction is more recently recognized as a threat for this species. Contaminants are also known to be a problem, again, as we heard about from Ingrid a little earlier today, particularly mercury, but also plastics. These birds have incredibly high loads of plastics, and we wonder about what the impacts of those might be. And of course, there are climate-driven ocean shifts that this species, as well as all the other species, are dealing with. So shifting our focus from expert opinion on what these threats might be to something a little more quantitative is something that the integrated population modeling team in our group is working on. So our Leach's storm petrel research in Eastern Canada focuses on three themes at the moment: demographic research and monitoring to estimate adult survival and productivity, which of course can go into the integrated population models. Year-round tracking, where we're modeling population level distributions and abundance at sea, basically to understand how these birds overlap spatially with different threats at sea. And then there's an integrated population modeling team that are working on quantifying the relative importance of the different potential drivers of the population decline. My work is focused largely on the large colonies in eastern Newfoundland. I feel like, anyway, my work is focused on these colonies in Newfoundland, and Ingrid mentioned the long-term work at Kent Island off of Nova Scotia earlier today. So in terms of demography, we found that breeding productivity is good, quite good in fact, and it averages over 85% at the colonies in Newfoundland. Productivity can be lower at the southern sites, but at the center of the range we're pretty confident that food supply during the breeding season is quite good for this species. Adult survival, on the other hand, is poor at the sites that I've been monitoring, and it's averaged about 83 to 84% apparent survival across the marking period, which is quite low for long-lived seabirds. In contrast, using the same field techniques and analytical techniques that we've used, two colonies off the Pacific coast of Canada of Leach's storm-petrels had annual survival estimates close to 98%. So they're a little godly, I guess, but certainly it suggests that it's not our methods that are causing any of the differences that we see. So we know that annual survival is poor, but what we don't know is when the birds are dying. So where's the survival bottleneck? In 2016, Day 5 Field designed and built a pit tag monitoring system to answer questions about seasonal survival in particular. So are birds dying in the summer or are they dying in the winter? And these results are starting to come in, and they're going to be really important to incorporate in that IPM. And the systems are also providing some really rich data on time of fledging and also adult foraging behavior and stint lengths at the nest. And they're being really nicely incorporated into a PhD project by Sidney Collins. About 10 years ago, tags became small enough to deploy on storm-petrels, first GLS, of course, and GPS followed in about 2016. So this summarizes our breeding season GPS data set since that time. And our goal was to achieve robust enough sample sizes so we could develop species distribution models for each of our 6 key colonies across the region. So we tracked over 450 birds, breeding birds, since this time. All I want you to note here is that the colonies are incredibly wide-ranging, which we've seen earlier for Leach's storm-petrel. The scale bar on this map is 800 kilometers. So birds are breeding from the Newfoundland colonies largely over the continental slope and out into the deeper waters, where they're feeding heavily on deep water mectophid fishes during the breeding season. And note also that these areas that the birds from the east coast of Newfoundland colonies are using are quite similar to the petrels that we saw from Monica yesterday. So it's interesting. And the other thing to note about these guys is that different colors represent different colonies here, so they're really largely segregating when they're at sea. And this is our non-breeding season GLS data set, again from our 6 key colonies, showing where the birds are in the non-breeding season. So we've tracked over 250 birds since 2012. And this overview shows you that all the populations are trans-equatorial migrants, and they're using several key areas during the winter time, including that important, the MPA, the NACES MPA in the North Atlantic. They straddle the equatorial waters north and south of the equator, and then they kind of carpet the whole west coast of Africa, mostly in pelagic areas. The overall colony distributions are similar across the colonies, but there will be some differences in the importance of the different areas to each of the sites. And another note about tracking is that Leach's was added to the C-Track species list last year, building on the rich data set that we have and the team in Iceland has for Leach's wintering distributions. So we'll be tracking, through C-Track, tracking the species across the Atlantic range. So there will be more winter data to come to assess connectivity in wintertime. And the other international partnership that's important and is just launched is SEGOS project that's run out of Barcelona University. This project is 6 storm-petrel species in particular, looking at distributions, diets, foraging ecology, and overlap with threats at sea. So very similar objectives to our Leach's work, and it's just launched this year. So it's very exciting collaborations to come out of this work over the years to come. For us, next steps with the tracking data involve building species distribution models to predict distribution and abundance throughout the annual cycle. So both at that Eastern Canadian scale during the breeding season and also the non-breeding season scale, so the whole Atlantic Basin. And Alison Patterson and Katie Studholm are busy building and testing these models. This is shows you the predicted distributions. It's a very draft version of the map, but predicted distributions in September, so when the birds are chick rearing. And the predictions here include all Atlantic coast colonies that have a population size greater than 10,000 individuals. So the red circle, the red circle shows colony location, and the circle size scales with the size of the colony. The small maps on the right are individual colony predictions. And you can certainly see that, not surprisingly, the large colony at Baccalieu Island, there off the east coast of Canada, really determines the overall density of birds within our region. So we're in the process also of developing geospatial data layers and data products to quantify the different threats that I've mentioned at sea, including disturbance from vessel traffic, as well as oil on the water, and certainly light pollution from a number of different data sets. And we're of course going to intersect those threats with the predicted distributions from our SDMs. Large-scale demographic modeling is a major undertaking, as all of you know. That's often data limited. But fortunately for us, a lot of long-standing collaborations within our region and partnerships that have been coordinated locally by Birds Canada, the BirdLife partner, have been really key to providing the detailed demographic data and also some information on strandings and mortality of birds across the region to feed into an integrated population model. So Greg Robertson and Anna Calvert are using these data sets to build an IPM for storm-petrels, and this is what the main components conceptually kind of look like. The model links together data components on, of course, population size, adult survival, fledgling success, and also some observed mortality. And you can see that all these factors are interdependent and feed into the population trends at each of the sites. The interesting, or the best, I guess the great benefit of using an IPM is that it explicitly recognizes spatial and temporal variation in these different parameters that go into the model, as well as gaps and uncertainties in their estimates. So the first component that the team tackled was the survival data set. So we've concentrated on the last 20 years. Survival across the region's been low, as Ingrid mentioned, and variable amongst the colonies. The colony averages ranging from about 81 to 88%. Modest annual variation, but there was no synchrony across the colonies, so it suggested colony-specific pressures might be having an effect. So we examined threats that could also vary spatially, and this is a paper that Ingrid highlighted earlier this morning, looking at the impact of mercury and predation levels on adult survival. And as she explained earlier, there were negative impacts both of mercury contamination during the breeding season and also predation pressure on adult survival. So the team's considering the other potential drivers of population decline that I mentioned earlier to quantify relative importance of these different drivers, and stay tuned because this work will wrap up within about the next year or so. So just a couple of take-home messages, if I may. The importance of long-term monitoring. So collecting the baseline information on population size and demographic monitoring data, identified population declines, and started the process of listing this species in Canada. Collaboration and data sharing has been really important through this process, as have significant resources from industry that have allowed us to increase our understanding of distribution and abundance of birds at sea and relative impacts of the various stressors, so this IPM that's ongoing. And ultimately, we want to provide science-based information to develop effective mitigation strategies to support the full conservation cycle of leech and storm-petrel in the Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you, April. We have time for one quick question. Over there, please.
Thank you for a good talk. Do you know if mercury levels in your waters have been changing, increasing, for example, over the last few decades or not? Thank you.
Overall, there has been an increase, but I don't think it necessarily reflects the temporal scale of the changes in, or maybe we don't know the changes in. Well, survival we don't know, but population size we do. So it doesn't really reflect the temporal scale of the population change.
Thank you, April. And if anyone has any other questions, I bet April is happy to chat after the session with you. Thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker comes from the UK, which is Richard Phillips, and he'll talk us about global responsibility on the conservation of albatrosses and large petrels.
Okay. Hi everyone, can you hear me at the back? Okay, big build up. Yeah, so, well, it's a delight to be here today. I've heard some amazingly good talks. Obviously, I'm going to bring the standard down so that, you know, I think it's appropriate. So I'm going to talk today about the trends, threats, and global political responsibility for the conservation of what ACAP have recognized as high priority populations of albatrosses and large petrels. So I should say I'm Richard Phillips from British Antarctic Survey, and one of my co-authors, Martin Beale, is somewhere in the audience. I won't make him stand up and embarrass himself, but he's got a mustache, so you can't miss him. So what is ACAP? Well, ACAP is the Agreement on the Conservation of Albatrosses and Petrels, and as you might expect, it's a global agreement, and it's aiming really to understand and address all terrestrial and marine threats to the listed species. So it came into force 20 years ago, and it's been ratified by 13 parties. It's obviously great to have as many parties as you possibly can. And the impetus was the presumed scale of the global bycatch in fisheries and the obvious, compelling case that required international action, hence an international agreement. And since then, reviews have indicated that there's at least 160,000 seabirds killed per year in longline fisheries. That was a review by Aurea Anderson, who's in the and BirdLife. She's in the audience now. At least 400,000 seabirds killed per year in gill nets. And a recent excellent review indicates that there's at least 45,000 seabirds killed per year in monitored trawl fisheries. And you have the referee to thank for the fact that it doesn't say probably more than 100,000 seabirds killed per year, but apparently you shouldn't play double or quits when it comes to scientific papers. And we don't know how many seabirds are killed by artisanal vessels, but it's certainly the same order of magnitude. So ACAP lists 22 species of albatrosses, that's all of them, 9 petrels and 2 shearwaters. And as part of the data collation exercise, for all these species, we know the number of breeding sites. Some are obviously single country endemics and the annual breeding pairs and so on. And I've put a couple here and that are not italicized, but the population sizes range, for example, from just 66 breeding pairs per year in Amsterdam albatross up to more than 1 million breeding pairs per year in white-chinned petrels. There's various different levels of confidence in the trends, but the other obvious thing to note, for those that aren't colorblind, I should have thought of this, is that all the red arrows indicate where the global population is declining. So what else? So what has ACAP managed to achieve in these last 20 years? Well, they've done a great job of developing extensive databases on everything you ever wanted to know really about these species, from what are listed in conservation listings and their breeding biology and their threats, population sizes, trends, etc. They've developed a great suite of conservation guidelines, including, most importantly, best practice advice on seabird bycatch mitigation in fisheries, but there's loads of other really useful information. So it's a great repository of guidance, and it includes, in fact, the recent guidelines on Patricia, who's in the audience somewhere, and others helped develop on, for example, working on birds during the recent avian flu outbreak. And there's also there's a meeting every year, and that develops on the basis of the best available evidence, identifies priority conservation actions, and there's an ongoing program identifying the survey and tracking gaps. ACAP also tries to build capacity in other countries where they have less resources, including through a secondments program. And then ACAP are also hope to engage as much as possible and to help with the parties' help at RFMO meetings. So those are regional fisheries management organizations which manage fishing in the high seas. And then I think one of the really useful things about ACAP is the very fact that it exists, because it provides a conservation imperative, the authority for ACAP parties and individuals, including many of us here, to do research and to advocate for actions that will help address the threats. And parties are also obliged to develop action plans for the high priority populations, for example, and national plans of action to address seabird bycatch in fisheries, and so on. And yes. So as part of the prioritization process by ACAP, and based on expert guidance, they've identified national fisheries where conservation action is required. So these are within EEZs, and you no need to really pay too much attention to that list here, but you can see there's a whole range of species all throughout the Southern Ocean, and elsewhere, and up in Spain, of course, for Balearic shearwater, where really there's a ACAP population that's declining steeply and is likely to be bycaught in those fisheries. Okay, so those are the kind of progress and stuff, but there's lots of challenges. there's limited engagement from some of the ACAP parties, even though they've signed up to the agreement. No new parties, which is obviously, again, a really bad thing since 2008. And ACAP are missing some key breeding range states that hold various albatross and petrel populations, or there are the migration destinations. And also the major fishing nations, several major fishing nations, particularly from East Asia, have not joined ACAP. Land-based threats, still a big problem, as we've heard a lot of. The invasive species eradications are costly and they're logistically challenging, and avian flu has taught us as well, that, and avian cholera that we've heard about the other day, are that many diseases are very hard to control. And then there's still a great deal to do in fisheries as well. Generally, seabird bycatch mitigation requirements are very far from best practice in most national fisheries and in the high seas. There's very poor monitoring of or enforcement of compliance with those mitigations, poor monitoring of bycatch rates, and that sort of thing. Then part of that problem in the high seas is, or part of the problem in the high seas is compounded by the fact that you can't really engage at the grassroots level with the crew or the skippers. And then lastly, for some small-scale fisheries, we don't even know what the most effective mitigation is likely to be. Still, poor representation of government fisheries and policy advisors at ACAP meetings, and so unfortunately, the majority of ACAP-listed species are still in decline. So, what can we do? And that's when I now finally come on to the main topic of this talk, which is the ACAP high priority populations. So although ACAP lists 33 species in total, and that breed at more than 300 sites, there's just 9 high priority populations. These represent more than 10% of the global total, and they're declining at more than 3% a year. So this is the list here. So wandering albatrosses, black-red albatrosses, grey-headed albatrosses from South Georgia, sooty albatrosses from Crozet, Tristan albatrosses from Gough, Indian yellow-nosed albatrosses from Amsterdam Island, waved albatrosses in the Galapagos, and then Antipodean albatrosses and Balearic shearwaters. So for those of a sensitive disposition and or who suffer from eco-grief, look away now, because these are the trends of the ACAP high priority populations. These are just there'll be a compilation soon where we'll update these, but these show some really quite frightening downhill trends. Although, you know what? Not as bad as the seabirds in Norway. So maybe there's hope yet. So what are the threats to these high priority populations? Well, mostly it's invasive species. Are the ones that are where the threat magnitude is the highest are Tristan albatrosses from Gough, Balearic shearwater threatened by, house mice on Gough, feral cats at 2 breeding sites of Balearic shearwaters, and avian cholera on one of the islands in there. And by the way, apparently there's 5 billion images of cats on the internet, but this is the only one I could find. Okay, so global political responsibility. So fishing is within EEZs and within the high seas, and it's overseen by different RFMOs and CAMLAR, which doesn't consider itself to be an RFMO. And so, what do we want to know? We want to know which are the key jurisdictions for these high priority populations. And then luckily, Martin, in 2021, published a paper that looked at the global responsibilities for all the ACAP species at the species level, but he was pleased to adapt that and apply the same methodology to look at global responsibility for the high priority populations. And luckily for me, there's already been an explanation of his methodology, so given this is a short talk, I don't need to go into that. Although had I known that the previous speaker would drop out, I could have taken another 15 minutes. Anyway, so these are the results. And only when I was sitting here in the audience looking at how hard the fonts were to read that I realized that the good thing about it is I made them so small that if you don't like tracking data or you're sick of hearing about the results, just take off your glasses and you'll have no idea what these graphs are about. So these graphs essentially indicate the proportion of time year-round by the high priority populations spent in different jurisdictions. And in almost every case, it's the high seas, with 1 or 2 exceptions. The detail here is not super important. The red is the breeding range states that where the species, where that population is. And this is really useful because we can identify exactly which jurisdiction, which national jurisdictions are responsible for part of the range of the species, and we can identify which RFMO is responsible as well for where the species spends much of its time. I mean, mostly it's the RFMOs within the same ocean basin, but often these species, because they're so highly migratory, will also spend lots of time elsewhere. And this is the same for, this is the other high priority populations from the Indian Ocean and Australia. So what do we do with this information? And the point here is really, and we should all be thinking about this, I think. There's been so many amazing talks in the last few days. There's an amazing amount of information we collected, but we also should really be thinking about how we can apply that information to improve conservation of seabirds. So this is quite a nice example, I think, where you're using focal species to help focus conservation action. So those results that I've just shown you have already been used to try and to help identify the key management jurisdictions, okay? And then now that information can then be taken to the RFMOs and it helps focus attention. It's rather than a kind of a vague, there's a lot of seabirds in trouble, but we don't really know on which ones we can concentrate. You can now say, look, you're responsible for large percentage of the time of the year spent by wandering albatrosses, so really, and they're declining really steeply, so what are you going to do about it? And then really the same applies when all these other bullets are about different ways of focusing attention. It also helps coordinate activities, so there's now bilateral or trilateral agreements between nations at either end of the distribution, so the breeding range and the non-breeding range. The very fact that we know that we can quantify time spent at different parts of the world allows us to say that you can't really come up with a sustainable bycatch in one jurisdiction because the birds are being caught elsewhere. And then really the other thing to do is to use these focal species to try and generally get more attention paid by policymakers, fishery managers, etc., all the way across the board. And in this, when I was just sort of getting towards the right in this talk, I realized that there's a lot we can learn from the adoption of our other charismatic or emblematic species in conservation campaigns for other taxa. So really we should be thinking imaginatively of how to best use these species to get conservation action. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Any questions? No? No questions? No. Otherwise, I have a question, Richard. Thank you. No.
Hello, thank you. Nice talk. I was just going to ask what your feeling is for what ACAP's position might be with reclassification of species, for example, Balearic and Yelko and shearwater.
Yeah, good question, Ollie. Well, there's a taxonomy working group, and they review the available information and then make a decision. And there's a few, as you know, there's a few kind of contentious taxonomic decisions to be made. Currently, they still consider Balearic shearwater and Yelkoan to be separate species. In fact, even if they become a single species, the Balearic population could still remain on the annex of ACAP anyway, so it wouldn't really make much difference currently. But yes, there's a separate taxonomy working group that do, consider what taxonomy.
Thank you. More questions? No? Otherwise, thank you very much. So, our next speaker comes from France. It's Mathilde Huon. That's cool. So it talks about interactions of marine food and scavenging seabirds in the Bay of Biscay.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Mathilde Huon, and I will present you the result of my postdoc on evaluating the interaction between marine food subsidies and the main scavenging seabirds species in the Bay of Biscay. So I realized this postdoc at the Observatoire Pélagis at the University of La Rochelle. So the exploitation of marine resources by commercial fisheries has changed marine ecosystem. Seabirds can interact with fisheries activities, and this interaction can generate competition, negative effects such as by catch, and sometimes positive effects with fisheries discards. So discards is the third most important anthropogenic food resources for wildlife, with a total amount of 10.3 million tons per year. And these marine food resources can affect 52% of seabird species and impact some different parameters of their behavior, such as of their ecology, such as their foraging behavior, breeding success, population dynamics, and community ecology. So the Northeast Atlantic can be perceived as a discard hotspot. And in this area, most of studies focused in the North Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And, but comparatively, a few focused on the Bay of Biscay, which is an area of, sorry? So, okay. Which is, it's better like that? Yeah, thank you. Which is an area of particular interest, as it is one of the most of the major fishing zones in Europe, and a wintering ground for seabird species. So in the Bay of Biscay, the large gull and northern gannet dominate the avian dynamic, with representing almost 70% of density of seabirds in this area in both spring and autumn. So following the landing obligation, the DREAM project was created, and with an objective to evaluate the fate and survival of discarded fish. So this project is divided into 3 parts: the surface, the pelagic, and the benthic part. So during my postdoc, I focused on the surface compartment, and I tried to understand the variability of seabirds and discard interaction, and try to quantify the amount of fish consumed by scavenging seabirds for each discard event. So we collected data on oceanographic survey with this boat, which is a research vessel called Thalassa, and it's a 75-meter trawler, and this research vessel operates oceanographic survey in spring and in autumn every year. So to evaluate the density of fish stocks, trawling operations are operated along transect, following by discard events. And during this survey, there is also observer who collect data on scavenging seabird distributions for this discard event, and also the data on number and type of commercial fishing vessels. So in addition, in the context of the DREAM project, I realized additional experimentation. So I tried to assess the flock proportion of scavenging seabirds, foraging of discards. I evaluated some foraging behavior parameters, such as catches quantity, and so the full to stomach, when it's like the northern gannet and large gull were completely full, and the success rates. So I also did some selectivity experimentation. Okay. So doing this selectivity experimentation, I tried to identify the preference of northern gannets and large gull. Sorry. Okay, so the result of this experimentation allow me to split the discard into 3 classes depending on the shape and the length of each fish, and giving us a different degree of interest. So first, to see if the distribution of scavenging seabirds is influenced by fisheries activity beyond their distribution dictated by oceanographic conditions along the continental shelf, I did a spatial modeling by using GAM. So first, I created what I call an oceanographic only model. So I used the number of scavenging seabirds as a response variable and the oceanographic parameters as explanatory variables. Secondly, I fitted what I call an oceanographic fisheries model by adding fisheries variable such as the density of fishing vessels and the quantity of fish discarded to the oceanographic variable, and then I compare the fit of the 2 models. So I did this data analysis for both species and both species group. So the result highlighted that in every case it was an oceanographic only model who had the lower AIC value, the higher AIC weight, and the best deviance explained. And if we compare the spatial prediction, we can see that the spatial prediction is more different for both species in autumn. For oceanographic fisheries model, I didn't put the result for large gulls in spring, as it was not selected by model selection. So this plot, if we plot the spatial prediction of both models, we can see that there is a big difference in autumn. The spatial prediction of oceanographic fisheries model, the highest spatial prediction when they reach a plateau. The spatial prediction of oceanographic only model are bounded. So this result suggests that at large scale there is a low influence of discarded biomass and distribution of commercial fishing vessels, suggesting that seabirds do not follow fishing boats outside their natural environment. The second part of my postdoc was to determine the rate of discard consumed by scavenging seabirds. So I create a model of consumption, including different outputs, and some of them were related to the seabirds parameters, such as the number of catches, the success rate, the composition of flock, and the number of seabirds. So depending of the discard quantity available, I first calculated the consumption of northern gannets due to their diving foraging behavior, and secondly, I determined the quantity of discard consumed by large gulls. And this gave me the total flock consumption. So this is the result. we can see that on average in spring, the discard consumption by both species, group of species, varies between 1 and 2%, and is around 5 on average for autumn. And on the map, we can see that there is some differences between sectors, with some hotspots in red on the map, with higher discard consumption reaching like almost 30%. These results are in accordance with those found by Despetele et al. In 2016. So in conclusion, our results can complete previous results in this area. However, future studies are needed to investigate interaction at finer scales. Because at large scale oceanographic conditions reflecting the distribution of prey manage the distribution of seabirds, and previous studies highlighted that the anthropogenic activities, the influence of anthropogenic activities, can be only detected at a fine scale. So for this, it will be interesting to continue this work by using telemetry survey to detect the interaction between seabirds and fisheries activity at the finer scales, and also to evaluate the inter-individual variability, and also the ecology of immature, as the immature represent a big proportion of seabirds in the Bay of Biscay. I developed my protocol in a big trawlers, and my protocol were adapted to other métiers. And as we know that there can be differences between offshore and inshore area, my protocol were also included in different programs in inshore area along the Atlantic coast. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Mathilde. Any questions from the audience? Jose, one over there.
Thank you for that. In your study, you analyzed the success rate of gulls, large gulls,
yep,
and of gannets. What was the composition of your large gull group?
With species.
Yes, which species?
It was lesser black-backed gulls, great black-backed gulls, herring gulls, and yellow-legged gulls.
And what was the majority? What was the main bird?
It depends where. In offshore area, at a certain distance of the coast, it was mainly lesser black-backed gulls. And so when you were closer to the coast, it was, at some point, it was a mix between lesser black-backed gulls and the great black-backed gulls, and also herring gulls and yellow-legged gulls. But when you, so the great black-backed gulls and herring gulls were more coastal compared to the lesser black-backed gulls. And the difference between the quantity of herring gull and yellow-legged gull, it depends of if we are on the north or the south of the Bay of Biscay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. One last question to Mathilde? Anyone? No questions? Okay, thank you very much, Mathilde. So our next speaker comes from Algarve in Portugal, and Ana Marçalo, and he will talk us about what we learned from the interaction between seabirds and bottom long nets.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for bearing with me and us. Is it on? So, just going ahead of it. My name is Ana Marçalo. I'm a researcher at CCMAR, the Center of Marine Sciences, from the University of the Algarve. And is Eleonore here from yesterday's talk regarding the toileting and menstruating? Oh, really nice talk. I mean, I have to thank everyone and the hosts mainly for having us here. But your talk was amazing, and I think to add to your talk, you should also add the questioning regarding menopausing. Okay, because these are always, you know, our companions when we start to age, and also 2 pairs of glasses. Now I have to decide which screen I have to look into, because I have these glasses to look further and these ones to look close. So, yeah, so I will be presenting you the results, or the final results, because this project is almost to an end, which was LIFE Ilhas Barreira. And I've been working with conservation projects regarding megafauna and interaction with fisheries for about 15 years now. And in 2009, where is it? Oh, okay. Sorry. We were challenged by this amazing consortium, or the leaders, which were SPEA, to work within LIFE Ilhas Barreira in this study area, which is Ria Formosa, which is a lagoon area, a protected area, and a very important area as an habitat for several species of birds, and particularly in some barrier islands, there are nesting grounds and important habitats for some species, such as the Odwin gull, for example, that has the largest colony in Europe nesting and breeding in this island, which is the, I don't have the, which is the Deserta Island. I mean, the consortium was very variable, and we were in charge of studying the interactions of these seabirds, a lot of species that habitat in this area, and use the coastal area to forage and feed. The target species of the project were the little tern and the Odwin gull that nest in the islands, but also the Balearic shearwater that, as we know, is critically endangered, and the most critically endangered European species that uses our coast, the Portuguese coast, as a foraging and feeding ground. So, just to provide you with a little bit of overview, on Tuesday already, Ana Almeida from SPEA already introduced us to this matter. Regarding birds bycatch and this topic in Portugal, we know that there are particularly 3 main fisheries of concern, you know, approaching this topic has been really recent. I mean, it has less than 10 years, as we can see by the few papers that are out and dedicated to Portugal, and very important papers. But we knew ahead of time, ahead of the project, that the 3 fisheries of concern are purse seining, set nets, and long lines. Particularly, purse seining has a seasonal problem with Balearic shearwater during summer months, mostly when the fishery has the highest effort dedicated to capture sardines. And then set nets and long lines they have some problems with either gannets or Balearic shearwater, and in general gulls. We have one paper out that is led by SPEA, by Ana Almeida, that tried a mitigation measure that provided very good results in the western coast of the Berlenga Islands, mitigating bycatch of mainly northern gannets in bottom set nets, and using this kind of scary bird kite provided interesting reduction of bycatch results. So ahead of LIFE Ilhas Barreira, we knew already a couple of things, and then particularly in Sesemar, back in 2018, 1 year prior to LIFE Ilhas Barreira, I coordinated a project dedicated to study the interactions of the local fisheries that are mainly artisanal, not only in the Algarve, but all over our country. 90% of our fishing fleet is like less than 9 meters of vessels in length. So it's really artisanal, and as we've seen in prior talks, we know that dealing with artisanal fisheries is really tricky, and we don't know much about this segment. But this project particularly studied the interactions of the fisheries and several taxa. And as we can see, for marine birds, for the whole Algarve region, or when we divide the Algarve region by areas, either eastern, that is called the leeward, or western, the windward, we knew that after an interview survey of more than 200 questionnaires, that the nets are definitely a problem all over the Algarve, and particularly in the leeward, where the study area of this LIFE Ilhas Barreira is working. So during LIFE Ilhas Barreira, for 2.5 years, we quarterly made a lot of questionnaires to fishers all over the study area and in several fishing ports. And these interviews provided almost 1,000. They provided already some hints. I mean, they, for example, showed us that we had higher bycatch rates in the local fleet, okay, in really small vessels, higher bycatch rates in mostly fall and winter, and the northern gannet and cormorant were the species more bycaught, and definitely more towards the eastern side. So another monitoring method that we used during the project was obviously to validate the interviews, was doing on-board observations, and particularly for this fishery, because we also tackled perseining, but in a smaller percentage. We did almost 200 observer trips for about 2 years, and we could say that we couldn't see a lot of bycatch, okay? And this is fairly common. I mean, capturing bycatch events, it's really, really rare. But we could take a lot of important observations, obviously. I mean, the higher bycatch risk is during very important operations during the fishing, either hauling or net setting. There were about 24 seabirds bycaught in those 2 years from 3 different genus. I mean, bycatch events are rare, but sometimes when they happen, they are very extreme, and more than 90% of the bycatch was actually happening in the last time period of the observation period in 2 weeks from Ardina gravis, which is the greater shearwater. So, going ahead on the subject, one of the actions during the project was testing mitigation measures. And we had tested 3 options, okay? One acoustic device, which was a megaphone that produced stress sounds of birds and was put or set up at the top of the wheelhouse, okay? And during net setting, it was producing the sound. We also tested the scary bird that already in the western coast was producing positive results in the fishery. But as we know, fishers are very reluctant to do anything that it takes them even, I don't know, 1 minute or 2 to do. And what we found was that when we were not on board, or the observers were not on board, they were reluctant to try these devices on their own. And we equipped them with logbooks so they could put information, basic information, when we were not on board, so we could increase the sample size. But they were not able to do it. So I usually like to work, and because I worked for more than 25 years as a fisheries observer, and I'm from a fishing family, I like to work on practical stuff that gets out of the paper, or for us scientists, sometimes we like to test a lot of fancy things, but that in the real world, we know that it's not practical and they won't do it. So during the observations that we were doing on board, the biologist and myself, we saw that actually changing fishing behavior and avoiding discards during the fishing operations, during hauling and net setting, was something interesting to test regarding the impact on mitigating bycatch. So actually the third tool or measure that we tested was what we called good practices on board or changing fishers' behaviors. We asked the fishers to retain all the discards, all the viscera during the operations, okay? And just get off those discards during steaming to harbor, okay? So this was a summary table of what we compared, like either hauls without doing anything, which were the controls, or the experimental, okay, for each one of the devices. So still regarding the methods, the observers gathered a lot of information. They collected a lot of data regarding the location. They followed the ESA's methodology to measure bird distance in several distance bands. And now the analysis is still in progress. We are applying some generalized linear mixed models to test some fixed and random effects. I'm not going to get into much detail on that because that is still ongoing and I don't have time. But regarding the results, what we were observing during these mitigation results were that more than 20 species were identified during the trials, and 2 species were bycaught. The most observed species were at least 3 species of gulls, either the yellow-legged, the black-winged, and the odd-winged gull. But because sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the 3 of them, we couple them in all one group. And also the gannets, they were present in almost all the trips. And we had these crazy events and very specific in a particular 1 or 2 trips. Okay, so moving on, megaphone. We compared control and megaphone use, and the results were actually not very good. I mean, you can see in red the controls and megaphone in blue, that actually the average number of birds or predicted counts are usually higher when we were using the megaphone, and sometimes statistically different, but always higher, concerning distance, species, and mesh size. However, for the scary bird and good practices, we got significant differences between the control and the bucket in green, and the control and scary bird coupled with bucket. And no significant difference between control and scary bird. So actually we were very happy that using the bucket, and only the bucket, without coupling the bucket with the device or anything, it was very important and a simple thing to do. So moving on, and then to wrap up, another action, an important action during these projects working with fishers, is promoting the good practices and do a lot of stakeholder engagement. So with all my colleagues, mainly from SPEA, which I would love to thank, we held a lot of participatory approaches towards the fishing sector. We held a lot of meetings, we held a lot of food and drinks and gatherings, and this is really important when we work together with fishers to create bonds. We developed some bycatch booklets and good practice manuals, and finally we produced a good practice promotional video to show in this kind of meetings and events. I have the video here, which is 2 minutes. I don't know if I'm allowed to
I will
run
allow,
it.
but then no questions.
Okay. You can question me. You can make me questions after. But it's really important because this video was created with very objective and simple language to approach fishers during several meetings. Now the project is coming to an end, but eventually in other projects that we hold with the fishing community, tackling several issues regarding even other taxa like cetaceans or reptiles or whatever, it's really important to, every time we have a meeting, to show them this video, because at least to know that we are contributing to reduce bycatch of marine birds. So the call for action, obviously, it's to keep the viscera in the bucket and just get rid of all the discards during steaming coming to the harbor. And this is
LIFE Ilhas Barreira. LIFE Ilhas Barreira, projeto criado com o objetivo de proteger o refúgio natural que as Ilhas Barreira abrigam. A incrível Ria Formosa. De entre as diversas ameaças a que a faixa costeira deste habitat e as suas espécies estão expostas, a captura acidental de aves marinhas na pesca é um problema. Nesta área tão produtiva, as aves marinhas e os pescadores disputam o mesmo recurso, o peixe. Quando pescam na mesma zona, as aves podem ficar presas nas artes de pesca, sofrer ferimentos ou até mesmo acabar por morrer afogadas. Foi a conversa com muitos pescadores nos portos de Quarteira, Olhão, Fuzeta, Tavira, Cabanas e Monte Gordo que conseguimos perceber quais as artes e operações de pesca mais perigosas para as aves. Esta informação recolhida em formulários é essencial para se identificarem ao mesmo tempo soluções para os problemas encontrados. Ao embarcar nas embarcações de rede de emalhar e tresmalho, detectamos que é durante a alagem e largada da rede que existe maior risco de captura acidental. A bordo podemos testar algumas medidas para manter as aves afastadas das artes de pesca, tais como o papagaio afugentador, em forma de ave rapina, ou o megafone, que permite sons de aves em apuros. Mas rapidamente percebemos que a solução mais promissora passava pela alteração de comportamentos por parte dos pescadores durante a operação de pesca. Durante a largada, se a rede for bem limpa e sem restos de peixe, é meio caminho andado para evitar espantosos mergulhos e investidas por parte das aves, evitando assim o risco de ficarem presas. Já durante a alagem, quando os pescadores amanham algum do pescado e atiram borda fora os desperdícios e outras espécies de baixo valor, é uma promessa de alimento fácil. Assim, pedimos aos pescadores que recolhessem os desperdícios num dos baldes ou caixas que têm a bordo e só as deitassem borda fora quando já fossem a navegar de volta à terra. Pedimos ainda que aguardassem por esse momento da viagem para limpar o barco, pois também nessa altura caem ao mar pedaços de peixe que podem atrair as aves. Resultado, menos aves a aproximarem-se do barco no período de risco. Em terra, fazem-se campanhas contínuas de sensibilização para a promoção destas boas práticas junto das comunidades pescatórias. Os pescadores são os atores principais desta história e os responsáveis pelo seu desfecho. O projeto LIFE Ilhas Barreira é cofinanciado em 75% pelo programa LIFE da União Europeia.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah. And if you have any questions to Anna, just ask after the session, please. Okay, and now to finish this session, I'll just ask Yvonne Lescornec, that comes from France, to give us a speed talk about the behavior of wandering albatrosses influencing the automatic identification of boats.
I think that's the end.
We are 10. Because we were testing it, right?
Yeah, I think so.
I think it's working.
Yeah.
Yeah, try to keep on this area because of the
Okay.
micro. Oh, but I brought down.
No, it's okay. Everybody hears me? Okay, perfect. So, hello, my name is Ewan Lescornec. I'm a PhD student in Chizé, in the CBC, and I will speak to you about my results about the automatic identification of bird-boat interactions. So just a little bit of context, as you may have mentioned. Fishing can be a threat to the environment, and for seabirds, which is a highly threatened group, the risk mainly occur through bycatch or overfishing events. But to date, our comprehension of those problems are still restricted due to the lack of data about boats. the recent access to AIS data, which is normally used for fishing safety, navigation safety, sorry, allowed us to try to have some new results about it, but it's still not enough. For example, in the southern Indian Ocean, the illegal, unreported, and undeclared fishing is still up to 30% of the total fishing. And the technologies to overcome this limit are still expensive and hard to deploy on large scale. So the question was, can we predict interactions with boats using only GPS data? Some tries have already been made, but I will try to go a little bit further. That one was previously done. So for this work, we will use tracks from snowy or wandering albatrosses from Crozet and Kerguelen from the French Southern Territories, which were fitted with both GPS data on the radar detector to automatically detect the radar emission from fishing boats. So we have 206 tracks spread over 3 years, from mainly Crozet in the end. Along the tracks, at each point, we know if there is a boat or not associated with the bird. So I will use just the easy was to make the model simple, to be able to use it on the old data sets we have. So I will use only the age and sex for bird informations, and for the trajectory derived metrics, I will use the speed, the sinuosity, and the first passage time at different radius to assess for both fine scale and large scale behaviors. And I'll fix myself a 15-minute sampling rate for the GPS data, because the tracking datasets have this sampling rate. So I will have to downgrade a little bit the fine scale behavior. So let's random forest. So for it, I will split my dataset in 2 parts. A first part that will be used to train and test the model. And here I will show only the accuracy. And then the second part to simulate unknown birds, which will represent the birds if we extend the model to the track in the past, they will represent those old birds. To the results. So after training, the model showed a pretty high accuracy of around 83%. So it was really it was a good result. So we were happy about it. And when looking at the important metrics, sinuosity, age, and speed seems to be the more important. But when we are trying to extend to the unknown birds, the accuracy dropped to around 50%. And for a binary classification, like I am doing, it's basically a random assignation of points. So how to explain this result? There are 3 main possibilities. The first one is that I'm not understanding the bird behaviors and what make a behavior, and I'm using the wrong metrics. But the more, I hope, the real ones are first the lack of precision in the data, so the downsampling rate show quite straight lines, and probably we are missing some fine scale behaviors, which are probably the ones that are different between natural foraging and bird associated foraging. And the other problem is the individual variability, which was really, really high in the dataset, and it can be both inter and intra-individual variability. But unfortunately, the fact that birds are rarely tracked twice, we cannot assess for both of these variability. So thank you for your attention, and if you have any suggestion, feel free to reach me.
Thank you, Huon. Any questions to Huon? One question over there, please.
Thanks for the talk, it was really good. I was wondering how close the albatrosses need to be to actually be considered as interacting with the boat, with the device you are using.
It's between 3 and 5 kilometers, it depends. But in this place, there are many huge fishing boats which have really, really long lines. It's mainly long liners. So even if a bird is like 2 or 3 kilometers behind the boat, he can still be attending with the boat.
Any more questions? One over here, Diana. Please.
Thank you for your talk. If you want to complete your data sets on the fishing activity, especially the illegal fishing activity, you can use there are two different, the VMS, the one you presented, it's the AIS. You can also use the light, actually on the fishing global watch, or I can't remember the order. You can also filter the data using the light, and it's a way to identify illegal fishing.
Yeah, but
especially in that area.
Albatrosses are mainly attending boats during day, so
Okay.
I'm not sure the lights
maybe
will
it's
be.
not working.
Because on the tracks, when you see it at a more fine scale, you clearly see at night they're mostly attend on sea, rest on the sea, and just don't basically forage much.
Any last question to you? No questions? Okay, thank you very much, Ewan.